Red and blue lights from the patrol cars flickered against the stained glass windows of Greater Faith Baptist Church. The colors stretched across the old brick walls, giving the place an eerie glow. Inside, past the empty pews and dark hallways, Deacon Marshall Gaines lay slumped over his desk. His white shirt was soaked in blood. 3 shots. Point-blank range. A Bible sat open beside him, its pages stained red. Just a few feet away, holding the gun, was Cameron Tate. His face was blank. He wasn't shaking. He wasn't crying. He just stood there, staring at the body as if something inside him had already died. Footsteps echoed against the marble floor as officers rushed in, weapons raised. "Drop the gun." Cameron blinked, as if waking up from a dream. Slowly, he lowered the gun onto the desk. He didn't fight. He didn't run. There was no point. A detective stepped forward, scanning the scene before locking eyes with Cameron. "What happened here?" Cameron didn't answer. Because the truth had started unraveling 2 months earlier. The sky darkened as Cameron and Renee Tate drove home from dinner with friends. Cameron kept one hand on the wheel, the other adjusting the radio. Soft jazz played in the background. Renee sighed, shifting in her seat. "I told you. We shouldn't have had dessert. My stomach feels tight." "You say that every time you eat too much." Cameron chuckled, glancing at her. She rolled her eyes but wasn't really annoyed. "I just need to stretch." She reached for her seatbelt, then a car ran a red light. Cameron slammed on the brakes. Tires screeched. Metal crunched. The other car clipped their bumper. Not a bad crash, but enough to shake them up. "Let's go to the hospital," Cameron insisted. "I'm fine," Renee protested, but he wouldn't let it go. "No chances. Let's get you checked out." 30 minutes later, they sat in a small hospital room. Renee perched on the exam table. Cameron leaned against the wall, arms crossed. A tired-looking doctor gave them a reassuring smile. "Good news. No fractures, no internal bleeding, just some bruising." Renee exhaled, relieved. "Told you I was fine." But the doctor wasn't done. She glanced at Renee's chart. "Since you're here, I wanted to mention something. Your blood work and ultrasound showed something interesting." Cameron straightened. "What do you mean?" The doctor smiled. "Congratulations, Mrs. Tate. The twins are healthy. You're about 4 months along." Silence. The world froze. Cameron's vision blurred. He stared at the doctor, then at Renee, waiting for her to correct the woman. To say there was a mistake. She didn't. Her face went pale. Lips parted in shock. Cameron knew that look. She wasn't happy. She wasn't confused. She was afraid. The doctor, unaware of the tension now choking the room, kept talking. "Of course, given your age, we'll monitor things closely, but everything looks great so far." Renee opened her mouth, but no words came out. Cameron felt like the ground beneath him had shifted. The doctor smiled, closing her folder. "I'll give you 2 a moment." The door clicked shut behind her. Now it was just them. Cameron's voice was low, too calm. "You're pregnant." Renee swallowed hard. I guess so." His tone darkened. "You guess so?" She shook her head quickly. No. I swear, Cam. I didn't know." His breath came faster. "And how does that happen, Renee?" She opened her mouth, then closed it again, struggling for words. Heat crawled up his spine. "We agreed. No more kids. You were already in menopause." His voice tightened. "You made me get a vasectomy." She flinched, looking down at her hands. The silence between them was suffocating. Then she let out a nervous laugh. Maybe the vasectomy reversed itself. The second she said it, she knew it was a mistake. Cameron turned to her, slowly. His jaw clenched so tight, she thought it might break. You think I'm stupid? His voice was sharp, cutting through the sterile air like a blade. Renee licked her lips, eyes darting toward the door. Cam, whose are they? His voice thundered through the small room. Renee jumped. Tears welled in her eyes. But she didn't answer. And that silence told him everything he needed to know. Cameron leaned back, running a hand down his face, his pulse roaring in his ears. She hadn't even known she was pregnant. If not for this accident, she probably would have kept it hidden until she figured out what to do. He thought about every church service they had sat through together, every handshake he had exchanged with Deacon Gaines, every Sunday morning sermon, every scripture quoted about righteousness and faithfulness. And all the while, this man, this fraud, had been sleeping with his wife. Cameron inhaled sharply, trying to steady himself. He didn't know what he was going to do next. But one thing was certain. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Renee swallowed hard, her throat working as if forcing down the truth. Her lips parted slightly. But no words came out. The color drained from her face, leaving her pale and exposed. That was all the confirmation Cameron needed. He nodded slowly, exhaling through his nose. With a measured motion, he lowered his arm, locked his phone, and slid it back into his pocket. You want to try again? He asked, his voice disturbingly calm. Renee's hands trembled, but she lifted her chin, clinging to defiance like a lifeline. It wasn't supposed to happen like this, she murmured. Cameron blinked, her words settling in his mind like a weight dragging him under. What? She shook her head and took a step back, retreating as if distance could undo what she had done. Cam, I didn't mean for any of this. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. He repeated the words slowly, tasting them, rolling them over his tongue as if trying to decipher the poison laced within them. His hands curled into fists. Renee let out a shaky breath. Cam, You made me get a vasectomy, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Renee flinched. You made me believe we were done having kids. You made me believe you were faithful. You made me believe I was enough. His voice cracked slightly on the last word, but the rage swallowed it whole. She had no response. Because there was no excuse that could make it right. Cameron inhaled deeply, his chest rising and falling in slow, measured breaths as a dark realization settled over him. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a moment of weakness. This was years of careful, calculated betrayal. His wife had built an entire existence behind his back, weaving a second life where he was nothing but an unwitting placeholder, while she indulged in her real desires behind closed doors. And the man responsible? The one who stood in front of the congregation every Sunday, preaching about loyalty, righteousness, and the sanctity of marriage? The one who had smiled in his face, shaken his hand, and blessed his family? Cameron exhaled sharply, shaking his head. This wasn't just infidelity. This was war. For 2 months, Cameron had suffocated under the crushing weight of betrayal. The rage coiled in his chest, pressing against his ribs, tightening around his throat every time he closed his eyes and saw their faces, Renee's guilt-stricken stare, Deacon Gaines's smug, knowing smile. But what burned most wasn't the affair itself. It was how easily the deacon had continued on with his life. As if nothing had happened. As if he hadn't stolen Cameron's wife. As if he hadn't humiliated him. As if he hadn't taken everything. That Sunday morning, Cameron sat in the back of Greater Faith Baptist Church, watching. Waiting. Deacon Gaines stood at the pulpit, his voice rich and confident, speaking about grace, redemption, and the power of forgiveness. Cameron almost laughed. It was so easy for him to preach about God while breaking the very vows he claimed to uphold. And that's when Cameron knew. The time for silence was over. Later that evening, Deacon Gaines sat alone in his office, finishing up paperwork. The last of the congregation had gone home, and the church was silent. He leaned back in his chair, sighing, reaching for his coffee cup. The door creaked open. He looked up, expecting the janitor. Instead, he saw Cameron Tate. The deacon's smile faltered for just a second before he recovered, sitting up straighter. "Brother Tate," he greeted smoothly. "Didn't expect to see you here this late." Cameron stepped inside and closed the door behind him. The air in the room shifted. Thickened. Deacon Gaines folded his hands, forcing a pleasant expression. "What can I do for you?" Cameron didn't answer right away. He reached into his coat pocket, fingers brushing against cold steel. Then, finally, his voice came, low, steady, cold. "You ruined my life." The deacon stiffened, his fingers twitching against the desk. "Now, brother," he said, his voice carefully measured, "let's not do anything we'll regret. I know emotions are high, but, do you?" The deacon swallowed. "I never meant for things to happen this way," he continued, shifting slightly in his chair. "You have to know that." Cameron exhaled sharply through his nose. "Oh, I do. Because my wife said the same thing." Silence. Slowly, the deacon lifted his hands, palms out, like a man facing a wild animal. "Brother," he said softly, "don't let the devil use you." Cameron's lip curled. "Funny," he murmured. Then he pulled out the gun and leveled it at the deacon's chest. The deacon's eyes widened. And then, 3 shots. Each one louder than the last. Deacon Gaines jerked back, his body slumping into the chair, head rolling to the side. The scent of gunpowder filled the office, thick and acrid. Cameron stood there, staring at the lifeless body of the man who had taken everything from him. But the rage inside of him didn't go away. The betrayal didn't feel avenged. He had thought this would make him whole again. It didn't. Slowly, he set the gun down on the desk. Then, he took a seat in the chair across from the deacon's corpse and waited. Because there was nothing left for him now. When the police stormed into the office, weapons drawn, he didn't move. "Put your hands where we can see them." Slowly, Cameron raised his hands, his face blank. "Drop the weapon." He nodded toward the gun resting on the desk. He hadn't touched it since he pulled the trigger. An officer rushed forward, yanking his arms behind his back, locking the cold steel cuffs around his wrists. Cameron barely noticed. The cold courtroom was silent as he sat with his hands folded, his expression unreadable. The weight of everything pressed down on him, the betrayal, the humiliation, the moment he pulled the trigger. His fate was no longer in his hands. The prosecution painted him as a cold-blooded murderer. He had walked into that church with a gun. He had planned this. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was premeditated revenge. Cameron barely listened. What more could they say? He had done it. There was no denying that. The defense took a different approach. This was a man who had spent his entire life being a good husband, a good father, a good man. And in return, his wife had lied, she had cheated. Manipulated him. Made him believe he was the only one, while carrying another man's children. The defense spoke of the emotional torment, the slow unraveling of a man who had built his life on a lie. They described the psychological breaking point, the moment Cameron realized that every vow, every whispered, "I love you," every promise of forever had been nothing more than a carefully constructed illusion. This wasn't just a man acting out of rage. This was a man who had been pushed to the edge, and finally fell over. The jury listened. Some of them even looked sympathetic. But sympathy doesn't erase a crime. After 3 days of deliberation, the verdict was read. Guilty. Not first-degree murder. Second degree. A crime of passion. A crime committed in the heat of the moment. Not premeditated. The sentence? 25 years. Cameron didn't react. Not when the judge read the sentence. Not when the gavel came down. Not when they led him away in cuffs. There was nothing left to fight for. His life as he knew it was already over. Some betrayals don't just break hearts. They ruin lives. Some wounds don't heal. Some people don't recover. Cameron wasn't the only one in a prison cell. Renee would never escape the shame. Marcus and Ayanna would never forget the disgrace. And Deacon Gaines? He had paid for his sins with his life. Because sometimes, love doesn't just hurt. It kills. If you crave gripping true crime stories, subscribe now. Because sometimes, love isn't just blind. It's deadly. Cameron Tate had once been a man of faith, love, and devotion, a husband who believed in forever, a man who built his world around trust. But trust, once shattered, has a way of turning love into something unrecognizable. Betrayal had poisoned his heart, stripping away the man he used to be, leaving behind someone he no longer recognized. In the end, the affair didn't just cost him his marriage. It cost him everything. Deacon Gaines lay dead. Renee lived in disgrace. Their children bore the scars of a tragedy they never asked for. And Cameron? He sat behind prison bars, the weight of his choices pressing against him like an unforgiving tide. Justice had been served, but at what cost? This wasn't just a story of infidelity, it was a story of destruction, of how love, when twisted by lies, can unravel into something dark and irreversible. Because sometimes, the deepest wounds aren't the ones that bleed.
Thanks for watching, and
They're
don't
the ones
forget
that
to
never
subscribe
heal.
to my channel for more